Hello and welcome back to Heimler's History U.S. Government Edition. So in this video and the next few we're going to start talking about the Constitution of the United States. But in order to fully appreciate it, we need to understand the historical context out of which that magnificent document was born. And so that means we need to start by talking about America's first Constitution, namely the Articles of Confederation. That's right, the Constitution that we know and love today is not our first Constitution, it is in fact our second Constitution. So in case you didn't know, America used to be in possession of the British. Our fair nation began as 13 fledgling British colonial settlements on the eastern seaboard of America, and in those days it was all tea time and bangers and mash. But one day the British and the French started a war that bled over into our continent called the French and Indian War, which lasted from 1754 to 1763. And long story short, the British/Americans won that war and everybody was happy. But then the British took our national rejoicing and went ahead and hawked a giant loogie on it. And how did they hawk said loogie? The British Parliament decided that since we Americans had benefited so tremendously from that victory, that we should also help pay for that victory. And so they enacted several new taxes upon the Americans, the most odious of which was the Stamp Act of 1765. This was a tax on all printed materials published in the colonies, but what it was a tax on is not as important as that they imposed new taxes. And the American colonists cried foul. How can you tax us when we have not consented to such taxes? We have no one representing our interests in Parliament. And the British responded by saying, well, that's just adorable. Pay your taxes. And then to make matters worse, Parliament passed another tax on tea, to which the colonists responded by dumping giant chests of imported tea into the Boston Harbor in something called the Boston Tea Party. But don't worry, the Americans were very honorable about it. They dressed up like Indians while dumping tea into the harbor. And so the British were furious about the waste of tea, and so they said, we are going to import tea to you, and the Mexicans will pay for it. Wait, that's something else. And so to pay for all the lost tea, Parliament passed another series of acts called the Coercive Acts. And the goal of the Coercive Acts is basically to bend the American colonists over the parliamentary knee and give them a good toddler-style spanking, and therefore break all of this resistance. But the more the British clamped down, the fiercer the resistance became from the American colonists, and so on July 4th, 1776, they formally declared independence from Britain. And so now that we had our big boy pants on, we needed a formal government. And our first attempt to do so was enshrined in a document called the Articles of Confederation. And probably the most important thing you need to know about the Articles of Confederation is that it granted governing power mostly to the states and left the central nationalized government very weak. And it's not hard to understand why. We had just broken up with Britain and we had kind of like a monarchy hangover, and so we didn't want to invest a national central government with too much power. And so we gave it mainly to the states. Now, under the Articles of Confederation, there was no president, nor was there any national Supreme Court. The only governing body under the Articles of Confederation was a Congress, and each state in that Congress had exactly one vote. Furthermore, each state was granted veto power over any changes in the Articles. And supposing there were no vetoes, they still had to have 9 out of 13 votes in order to change the Articles themselves. Now, this is what's known as a supermajority, and it's as difficult to muster as it sounds. Also, fun fact, under the Articles, each state could coin its own money and make treaties with other nations. Oh yeah, and while all this is going on, we're fighting a revolutionary war against Britain. And that was a problem because old George Washington's troops were in dire need of basic provisions like food and ammunition, but the federal Congress couldn't give it to them because under the Articles they had no power to extract taxes from the states. And when Congress tried to pass a motion to give itself the authority to extract taxes from the states, Rhode Island, which only represented 2% of the population, vetoed it. So all that to say, the Articles were a hot mess. And so something had to be done. And it was at that time that a small group of leaders convinced reluctant delegates from the states to meet for a constitutional convention in Philadelphia in 1787. And their goal in this convention was to address the defects that were so glaringly obvious in the Articles of Confederation. And the truth is, because no state really wanted to give up power and invest it in a central government, they were going to have a very hard time convincing them. But then something fortuitous and momentous happened. In the years after the Revolutionary War, there was economic chaos among the states, and that bred a grinding depression. Especially hard hit were farmers. When these farmers could no longer pay their debts, one of them, namely Daniel Shays, led a group of angry farmers to the Massachusetts State Arsenal and tried to take it over. And their goal was to pressure the government to stop prosecuting farmers and taking their land when they could not pay their debts. And so that's when Massachusetts picked up the phone and called the president for backup. But wait a minute, there is no president, there is no standing army, there is no backup, they had nothing. So even though the Massachusetts militia eventually squashed the rebellion pretty handily, it made everybody in Massachusetts a little twitchy because they could see that there were serious flaws under the Articles of Confederation. And so with this skirmish in the background, the delegates met at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in May of 1787, and as they discussed problems with the Articles, they realized that there was very little hope for improving them. And so Alexander Hamilton and James Madison took it upon themselves to redirect the convention into writing a new constitution, and that's exactly what they did. And we're going to look at that constitution in depth in another video, but for now I'll leave it there, and I will see you next time. Hey, thanks for watching. On the off chance that you like bearded bald men who pontificate about government and history, then subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. If you like the Constitution, then hit the like button down below. Other than that, YouTube thinks you're going to like that video right over there, and you know what? I think they're right.